We've already mentioned in an earlier HutVent this year how in 1914 the Germans were perfectly aware that once hostilities had broken out, there'd be virtually no chance of resupplying far-flung parts of their own empire. That didn't mean that German troops stationed in those places weren't prepared to put up a fight to defend them. Tanganyika, which in those days was known as German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, is a very good case in point. The German commander, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, certainly thought it was worth defending and knew that if he could put up a fight for long enough, he would tie up a lot of British resources for really no gain whatsoever. The British decided that it would be an easy win. They would land a group of soldiers at the port of Tanga, not far south of Kenya, send a load of troops ashore, point out the error of the German ways, and it would all be over and done with. And they could move on and do something more important. And the first thing they did was send a Royal Naval officer who, playing the mindless optimism card, went to see Lettow-Vorbeck and suggested that they might like to just surrender, knock it on the head, lower the flag, Brits would take over, job done, and they could all have a more comfortable war. Needless to say, Lettow-Vorbeck wasn't up for that at all, and thanked the Royal Naval officer very kindly and sent him on his way. That did nothing at all except give the Germans warning that the Brits were coming and give them time to prepare a reception committee. On the 3rd of November 1914, Indian Expeditionary Force B is landed at Tanga. They'd come straight from India, they were probably the nearest troops available, and in those days an Indian infantry brigade, of the 4 battalions, there would be 3 Indian battalions and 1 British battalion in each brigade. So amongst the troops that were landed, there were troops like the Kashmir Rifles, the 98th Indian Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion of the Loyal North Lancs Regiment, of which William Merrison here was a member. They land on the 3rd of November, they get the troops ashore, they start landing ammunition, supplies, food, blankets, everything you could possibly need for a campaign and then to make yourselves comfortable once you've won it. And then they start pushing inland. And very quickly, the Kashmir Rifles and the 2nd Loyal North Lancs reach the town of Tanga, a few miles past the port, and they raise the Union flag, and they've captured it pretty quickly. And then they try and push on and can't. They meet a lot of resistance. The fighting gets much heavier. The Germans start working their way around the flank to get behind them. And in the midst of all this madness, bursts of rifle fire cut through the trees, hitting bees' nests up in the trees, releasing massive swarms of really, really angry bees. And the 98th Indian Infantry in particular find themselves on the receiving end. They sting the German Askaris as well, so it wasn't entirely one-sided. But the fact that both sides had been clobbered by these bees led to the battle afterwards being known as the Battle of the Bees. In fact, there were even propaganda stories which said that the Germans had set up little traps in order to release the bees at crucial moments to fight for them, which clearly was utter nonsense. The upshot was that the British and the Indian soldiers really couldn't get any further progress and gradually started falling back to the beach. There was a point where the Germans had actually pulled back themselves without telling Lettow-Vorbeck, so actually the British, had they advanced, they might well have been able to capture everything and keep going. But by the time the British had realised the mistake, and then the Germans were already on their way back, and they weren't going to make any further progress. And eventually, Aitken, the Major General commanding the British and Indian forces, decides that the only thing to do is to withdraw completely and get his troops back on the ships and get away from Tanga. That's what they do on the 5th of November, which coincidentally is the same day that William Merrison dies of his wounds, and he's buried in Tanga in the cemetery. So the British pull away, leaving on the beach an enormous heap of supplies. Bits of uniform, equipment, boots, food, ammunition, weapons, you name it. Enough kit to really, really be useful to the Germans. And Lettow-Vorbeck realises that the Germans are pretty much cut off and surrounded. They're not going to really get any more help from anybody. There is a German cruiser has arrived, the Königsberg, and again, that's really stuck. It's got nowhere to go, so they back it up the Rufiji Delta, and eventually they'll take some guns off it and use those as portable artillery, making some wheels for them. And the Germans start to just pull back into the bush, and start fighting as the British start sending more and more troops to land in other places. The Germans start fighting pretty much a guerrilla war all over the country, ranging throughout the whole of Tanganyika, into a bit of the Belgian Congo, south into Portuguese East Africa, and they tie up British, Indian, South African troops for the entire war. In fact, the war is finally over on the 11th of November. I think it's the 12th of November, might even be the 13th of November, where Leto Forbeck finally bumps into some British troops, and they say that it's over, it's done, it's finished, you've lost. And the fact that he was undefeated, his troops were undefeated throughout the entire war, meant that the British commander who accepted his surrender allowed him to keep his sword, which was pretty much unheard of. And he became a national hero in Germany. They were literally the only undefeated German troops throughout the entire war. The story of the East Africa campaign is quite extraordinary. The Germans were making their own medicines. They were inventing all sorts of scientific instruments because they had nothing. They had to make everything. They were creating weapons. They were making clothing, you name it, as well as raiding depots in other countries to try and get ammunition and goodness knows what else. It was a very extraordinary campaign, and Leto Forbeck and his East African Askaris deserve all of the credit.